Test, 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 test. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay, you can hear me now. So that might mean that it was me, in which case none of you guys heard me at all for the last 15 minutes. Holy shit. That really explains a lot. Okay, so I don't know if I said this before, but the Big Tap is oh my God. Okay, the Big Tap is the channel that I normally use for interacting. I know that there's a chat channel on the stage voice channel or whatever, but like that showed up after the fact. So if you guys want to interact with me and ask questions and stuff, please do so in a channel called The Big Top. Now, before I just go over everything I just did, does anybody have any questions for me right now? Does anybody want to start with a question for me? Holy fuck. Was there really no, like, there was no audio? Okay. Wow, okay, yeah. So, hey, anyway, I guess that first 15 minutes was practice for me. Anyway, who has a question? Who has a question from the start? Just wants to just point blank ask me a question. Okay, I'll just answer the question that I think a lot of people are asking in their head. We expect to have Pyre AVAX and meeting on Avalanche within, let's just say, hours to days. Let's put it that way. The latest days, as soon as hours. But again, I don't control that. And then what we'll do is we'll deploy the incantation Witchvault in parallel on all three chains. And by the way, when we actually start doing the incantation Witchvault stuff, that is really part of the witch side of the game. So we will be doing the like training for that in the Pyre Swap Discord itself. So it is recommended, by the way, that you guys all learn the complete game because in the future, you all need to know how it all kind of works together in order to like navigate it best, especially for your for whatever team you're playing for, even if that team is yourself. But yeah, so meeting and metatrage, like let's put it this way. Prince and bonds and stuff like this. Knighthood servers. 2, meeting and metatrage. This is like both. 3, IWV and such. Coven server, which is Pyre Swap. Does that make sense? Because that is kind of like the witch territory versus the fucking knight territory, and the meeting and metatrage is like the border between those zones. Does that make sense to you guys? I hope it does. But anyway, you guys are encouraged to learn all of it. Even though you might not end up using all of it, you are encouraged to experimentally try it all so you can figure out how it works. There's a bunch of different ways to make it make sense for you. And yep. Okay. So, wow, I guess the last 15 minutes. And the incantation Witchvault could also be within, I don't know, a week. That might be like the fastest. Please don't quote me on that because I don't really control that. But the incantation Witchvault is also mostly done. So it will be like just configuring it and making sure that the minimum viable version of it is actually accomplishing the goal we want it to accomplish. Hope that makes sense to y'all. Okay, so okay, I'm assuming nobody else has any questions. No questions, and you guys can hear me over there in the big top. Fantastic. Okay, so since we've got Chatman and Alessio here, it might be useful to talk about the actual concept of credit associations and credit unions. Because when we talk about a really fucking A, man. Really? Okay, Chatman, do I sound quiet? Yeah, could be app volume. Okay, all right. Okay, fantastic. That really helps a lot, by the way. Okay, I got to check that more often. But anyway, so Alessio and Chapman, since you guys are here and you guys are angling like you're going to be knighthood players. So I want you guys to understand, the peg coin when it comes into the world, as it were, right? The peg coin can really come into the world from like two different reasons, right? It can come into the world from Genesis, or it can come into the world from printing. Does that make sense? And the reason it comes into the world from printing is because what effectively the boardroom is looking at, can this economy sustain more debt? Does that make sense? And what that means is, can we take a risk on this economy? So when the boardroom prints, it's basically looking at this project and it's saying, can we take a risk on this? I don't know if you guys noticed, but it's almost like when these things lose peg, nobody wants to play with the fucking Synergy protocol anymore because they're looking at it like itself. It doesn't make sense to take a risk on it. And what's kind of interesting is that the boardroom stakers are simultaneously the people who are taking the risk and the people who are getting evaluated. As does that make sense? So you end up with this kind of like group decision about taking a risk. And this is actually great because this is kind of like the seedling of microfinance. It's way easier for everybody to take a small risk than it is for one person to take a large risk. Does that make sense? And what's crazy is that you get to effectively look at the behavior of like all the investors in the system, and that is what kind of determines whether or not you're risk worthy. So when these things fucking lose peg, it's not like a mystery of why it happens. Like, does that make sense? Either the operator fucked up or the investor fucked up. You guys get what I'm saying? And the point there is that it's not really always meant to be above peg, right? Like these things are not meant to print every single epoch, like no matter what. But they should be able to venture above peg when the economy or when the association appears to be more creditworthy. Does that make sense? Does this association appear to be more creditworthy? And how do you guys suspect, or how do you guys deduce that a credit association? When we talk about this, we're talking about tomb forks, by the way. Let me show you guys. a. Let me show you a diagram here in the big top. Do you guys see this diagram? Okay, you do see it? Fantastic. You did so. So what's hilarious is that those three share coins, those boardrooms, they're actually both like they're both a credit. Okay, they're both individualized and they're like corporate at the same time. When you take three boardrooms, and turn them into a braid, as it were, it becomes both of these things. So natural person credit union, meaning it is serving the stakers themselves, but through braiding LP, it is also extending credit to its sibling associations. Does that make sense? And the thing is, when these associations extend credit to each other in parallel, they're able to kind of like manage this by braiding them together in LP. Now, you guys have heard of that before. We talk about braiding liquidity when you take peg coin pairs like this. Okay, this is like, I'm gonna probably go over this topic a lot, but to be honest, you don't need to understand it all. Like I'm not trying to make that sound like I don't think you guys are smart enough to, but there will just be guidelines on how to do this the right way. Okay, so these right here are like liquidity pairs, right? And you'll notice that the ones that are vertical are the ones that kind of tie in the 3 peg coins. And what this does is it allows a destiny for peg coins after printing that doesn't immediately just lead to them increasing the amount of debt. Does that make sense? What you basically have to do is you get to like delay the amount of debt. And it's not even just the debt, but do you guys know what net interest income is? Do you guys know what NII is? Okay, NII is the primary metric that a bank is measured for making money using money. Does that make sense? So a bank will borrow money from people who open savings accounts, right? And then it will lend it towards people who apply for mortgages. Does this make sense, Alessio? For like their houses. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, so basically in between those two, in between that borrow and that loan, there is a margin. Does that make sense? So like they're going to keep that margin there. That is their profit margin, and that's also how banks stay solvent. Does that make sense? That margin is also like where they need to be for solvency for the sake of what they call a direct demand account or whatever, right? Or demand deposit account, DDA, which is like checking and savings. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, fantastic, Darusik, fantastic. Okay, Alessio, and okay, so Darusik, Alessio, and Chapman, have you guys all heard me talk about braiding LP so far? Have you guys heard me talk about like this is kind of a necessity? Not like a necessity, but like this is something that helps the function. And this is what braiding LP does, and I want to explain it to you. The whole print, yeah, well, that is the meme, yes, but the whole print itself is, yeah, that's what Jeff likes to do, is debt. Does that make sense? So, how do you justify cashing out this debt? Does that make sense? Imagine that every print is like a credit card you get issued. Does that make sense? How do you justify cashing out this debt? Well, when you get a print of Frozen Tomb and Snow Tomb, or 2 ohm and 3 ohm, you make that loan go to work. Does that make sense? So you're going to take that 2 ohm and 3 ohm, or that Frozen Tomb and Snow Tomb, and you're going to deploy that as LP. Why? because that LP is going to begin working off the debt that the entire print just created. Does that make sense? So effectively speaking, depending on how depending on what we can drive APR to, personally, I think we're going to get really nice, for braided LP. It is my goal that this is like a transaction volume storm index. Okay, this is something I talk about inside the circus a lot. I don't know if you guys know about this, but the way the incantation of Witchfall works, it could in fact be one of the highest ratios of transaction volume to TVL, like as far as all dexes go. Okay, it might be theoretically it could be. Okay, now in order for that to happen, these LPs, like these things you would do with your prints, you're going to turn them into LP as opposed to literally just, I don't know, fucking cashing them out for meme coins or cashing them out for avalanche inscriptions or whatever the fuck you want to do with your money. Because what you can basically do is you can actually make this system, if the majority of the stakers, if the majority of the association members, if the majority of the ones that are holding the share coin all end up doing this, you're no longer like just fucking shitcoining. You effectively have created this new type of credit factory, this new type of credit union. It's I'm calling it decentralized credit union because I don't know what else to call it. And I think when you call something in Web3, and if it has an aspect of decentralization, you should call it decentralized credit union. But it's also like to describe it like this, it's also like a triple instrument fucking factory, like a 3 instrument credit factory. It is really something that's never been fucking kind of devised before. For shorthand, I'm going to just call it decentralized credit union. And this right here is the version that's decentralized aggregated credit. Decentralized aggregated. And that, by the way, you're going to see that DACU. As we bring PyroSwap through its phases, we're going to add more and more activities and features that kind of allow wallets to establish more and more credit worthiness. Does that make sense? And we're just going to be able to give people the options of whether to do activity X or do activity Y, or do activity X in a short time or do activity X in a long time, right? And effectively speaking, what we're going to end up seeing, I'm pretty sure, is that the people who end up braiding more LP and end up holding higher amounts of braided LP, they're also more credit worthy on individualized loans as well. Does that make sense? So it's not just the fact that, oh, hey, I can braid my LP and this is actually a passive income vehicle and it's resistant to IL and it's basically like, having, once you see that print, right? It's like having fucking Phantom, but you get APR on it, which is originally the original promise of a lot of these tomb forks. Does that make sense? It's just like holding Phantom, but you get APR on it. Remember that? The farms promise? Well, we're going to effectively create that through this concept of Vibratile LP. And effectively speaking, these coins kind of stay around the same price. They, in fact, they kind of get gravitationally pulled together. And that is, that mitigates IL, if that makes sense. I can't really get too much into detail about how this becomes a DICU over time, other than the fact that it involves probably a lot of subgraphs and a lot of data analysis systems. So let's put it this way. Again, that's actually a great example. Like, you would just look at one wallet and you would say, okay, I see that this wallet has 1,000 2 share, right? And they have 1,000 3 share, and they have 1,000 Z share. And then you would look at 1,000 2 share, 1,000 3 share, 1,000 Z share, and you'd be like, okay, where do they rank as far as 2 share, 3 share, Z share stakers, right? Does that make sense? As you guys are aware, there would be a wallet ranking for the stakers. Would you guys agree that you can actually find this on Phantom Scan, right? You guys would agree that like you can pretty much find out who the biggest wallet is in the, yeah, okay. So Lizio, at the same time, you would say, okay, are they in that same position for braided LPers? Does that make sense? You get what I'm saying? So if somebody is in like 11th place or somebody's in 35th place, right? If they are in 35th place for question for number one, shouldn't they also be somewhat near that place for number two? Does that make sense? So when we're kind of deriving credit rating systems like completely blind using only blockchain data, this is a question that we could ask. Does that make sense? Do you guys get what I'm saying? Because if they're in 35th place with the prints, it's like, well, if they're managing that debt correctly, then they should also be around 35th place for braided LP. Would you guys agree with that? Does that make sense? Like, it's not going to always be, the exact same place, but you could think about, like, is there more than 20% deviation there? Does that make sense? And hey, by the way, maybe if their LP ranking is higher than their staking, maybe if their braided LP ranking is higher than their boardroom staking, perhaps these are the most creditworthy people at all. Does that make sense? And then effectively, as PirateSwap evolves, we will effectively make the assumption that they are. Does that make sense? And the reason, you might be wondering, why are we able to make these, uncollateralized loans? It's like, well, first of all, if you understand that the boardroom printing was effectively circulating debt into the economy, it's always been an uncollateralized lending system, right? That paradigm was just never really taken into consideration. I think PirateSwap needed to exist for this viewpoint to kind of come to the forefront, because what PirateSwap offers is an ability to reclassify debt by allowing the debt itself to be declared bankrupt, right? I hope I sound like I'm not speaking just brutal gibberish right now. Do you guys have any questions about what I've said so far? But by the way, based on your ability to manage this debt, like, that's your savings and it can grow. And as that savings like continues to pay itself off, you absolutely can just fucking pay yourself. Does that make sense? Because based on the way that humans understand that debt, one, you're making the Sharecoin value go up. Does that make sense? Do you guys know why you're doing this? Okay, let's start with this. If the debt is getting mismanaged, what ends up happening to the APR? The expansion rate of the boardroom. It goes down, exactly. Do you know why, Alessio? Well, more sells than buys, 100% Darusik. But is it Darusik or Darusik? Okay, I'm going to call you Darusik. So once it gets to 0.80, yeah, exactly, indeed. Once it gets to TWAP, right, meeting toggles back on, and this becomes the seatbelt that brings it back up in price. However, if Meads outpace prints, this means that total supply is net decreasing. Does that make sense? So, in a scenario where 100% of boardroom stakers just dump 100% of their prints for more share coin, what happens? Yes, this will make the share coin price spike. However, it will not make APR go up. Does that make sense? In fact, since the price of the share coin is going up, if APR doesn't follow in proportion, APR per coin is going down. Does that make sense, Jerusik? Fantastic. So people, back in the day when farms were the thing, people would just do that, right? Because it made sense to dump the print for the share coin because that basically made the farms go up in APR. So you could basically dump your print for share coin, and this would effectively wrap itself around. So while the farms were live, this seemed like it was feasible to do. But the farms are not live, at least not during phase one. And this is not exactly the right move. You're effectively putting debt in the system, which the farms, which while they are the main focus of the economy, they can be there to pay it off. But effectively speaking, without the farms, you don't have that support there. The only support you have now is terminal utility, which in the Pyrosolve ecosystem, this is at 0.8. And it's there for a reason. Like we made it distant for a reason, because if you make it too close, well, then you can in fact destroy your debt system. But so once you're a boardroom staker, so once you're an absolute boardroom whale like Alessio or Chatman, you are effectively, you really want your share coin price to go up organically and not mechanically. Do you guys know what I mean by that? Organically. Share coin price, yeah, exactly. Share coin price goes up because APR goes up, right? Mechanically, share coin price goes up because of price impact spike events. Does that make sense? You want the market to kind of arrive at the opinion. Does that make sense? Organically. You want market forces to kind of arrive at the opinion that the share coin before was undervalued. Does that make sense? It's not like this. This is where I argued a lot with Web3 devs back when we were doing campaigns, because I was actually just looking at a chat I had in March of 2022, and I was telling people, let me see. Let me make sure they're not my audience. I was telling people, somebody was, let's see. I was telling people, if you put a tax on your coin and your coin is supposed to be compared to the gas coin, once your farm is over, your coin is now even shittier than it was before. Because when your coin is compared to the gas coin, the gas coin can be used for gas. Does that make sense? Like, if you're bullish on Phantom, you can be bullish on Phantom. But you know what else you can do with that Phantom you bought? You can also use it to do shit on Phantom. Does that make sense? Like, there's an alternate usage to the Phantom in your wallet. If you just have Tomb or 2Ohm, does that make sense? And there's not, well, Tomb now has Tomb Chain. But if you remember back in 2022, there was no utilities at all for these things. Once the farms end, You just have a coin that, while it did track the price of the gas coin for a while, once the speculation value kind of dries up, you don't have anything underlying to kind of ever make anybody want to buy it. I hope that makes sense. And it's sort of like this very overlooked type of facet, but that's kind of what I stake my entire fucking reputation on. But if you can raise the price of your share coin, your share coin's APR organically, because you are in fact making it. Let's go back to this diagram. You're effectively simultaneously the underwriters when you're the boardroom stakers. You are simultaneously the underwriters and also who the risk is being taken on. Does that make sense? This is a really new. I need to like write out the game theory for just the fucking knighthood, and I promise you, it's not going to be 3-3. I promise you, it's not going to be that. I'm gonna burst the vein in my fucking neck. But I will write out a combinatorial game theory matrix for you guys on the boardroom, specifically talking about whether or not you're braiding LP or whether you. Well, anyway, do you guys know what we've kind of hypothesized is like the good ratio for braiding LP? Do you guys know what this ratio is? It was in the Turkish QA document. Okay, so Alessio, I don't know this yet, but I do think that 70-30 is a good ratio, and this would be like 70% braid in LP, and then like 30%, go buy more share coin or go shit coining on Arbitrum or pay your rent or whatever. Does that make sense? And the reason I think this way is because if 70% is going towards deepening liquidity and only 30% is getting advanced, we'll call it like a cash advance, right? Getting advanced, you are at least deepening liquidity at twice the rate you are advancing cash. Does that make sense? But at the same time, if the LP APR can get above 50% just from transaction volume, what does that mean? That means that the LP you braided effectively is paying off the debt from your cash advance within the year, maybe. Does that make sense? So what's interesting about this is like that sounds like it's a really fucking long time. I'm not saying that you need to go a year between prints, but what I'm saying is the LP that you have will continue to compound. Does that make sense? It's actually hard to simulate this, but it actually could do that maybe within 6 months. But the point being is this braided LP that you have, it will just continue to pay off debt. Does that make sense? So in the future, you might be able to fucking advance a lot more than 30%, and safely too. Actually, during what I think the first few prints will be, you might want to focus more on consolidation than braiding LP. Does that make sense? So you're going to have a whole bunch of people. Let's be honest. You're going to have a whole bunch of idiots who are going to be acting exactly like they did in 2022 concerning the boardroom. You guys would agree with that? Like that's what you should expect, right? And because of this, I will tell you this, the Banneret and Chandler playbook involves ways to kind of like starve them out. Does that make sense? And one of the reasons we have 3 boardrooms is for the purpose of doing that. You get what I'm saying, Alessio? So, Alessio, you'll be able to, if that makes sense, if you find that one boardroom has too many parasites in it, you can, in fact, rule them with an iron fist by just starving that boardroom out. Like you don't need to actually work towards that boardroom getting prints, because guess what? You do have those two other boardrooms in your trifecta. Does that make sense to you? And this is a way that you can always kind of, it's almost like Pavlov's dogs. Does that make sense? Like, so whichever boardroom is behaving the best, that's the one that you're going to end up working on their printing strategy. You get what I'm saying? Now, granted, ironically, you need to braid LP. So, Alessio, or just don't fucking get them to peg. Or just don't get them to peg. Like, they're not, okay, if they're all being parasitic, it's still going to take the knights to be coordinated in order to get up to peg. Do you know that? You might not know this yet. So, Alessio, have you been following Dibs? Have you been following the way that Dibs is sort of like slowly kind of meandering up in TWAP? Yeah, Kiedezo's a fan of Dibs. Have you guys been following this? Dibs right now, of course, is the best example that metatrage works. And the reason why, and Alessio, and it's fine if you, and I actually appreciate that you're not dabbling in everything, because it's important to kind of narrow your focus. But the point being is, Alessio, do you understand that Mead and metatrage by itself can't really get you much higher than 0.8? You understand that? Like, it can get you maybe like 0.85 if you really start hammering price. But metatrage is not meant to get you all the way to peg, right? The decay of Pyre Phantom actually turns off at 0.802. Okay? Follow me there? And so does the Mead as a utility. You follow me? We have this range, right? You're going to hear it called the Vibratile range. You might hear it called the Battleground. Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. Well, one, Alessio, Dibs is literally, holy shit. If I should show you the fucking numbers, man. Dibs is tiny. Dibs is like the same size as Xeon. Does that make sense? Dibs is by itself. No siblings. Does that make sense? No sibling tokens right now. Does that make sense? Okay. And its market cap, which might be now higher, but its market cap was like 24K, and Xeon was, I think, 28K, right? Does that make sense? Those are probably, those are 2023 figures. Okay, so right now, 2024, the market caps are probably a little higher, or maybe Zoom is lower, who knows? But the point being is, it's around the same size as Xeon. Does that make sense? But here's the thing. Pyre Phantom needs to work on fixing 2-ohm, 3-ohm, and Z-ohm at the same time. Do you get what I'm saying? So every time somebody metatrages one of those coins, Pyre Phantom gets whipped. Yeah, Pyre Phantom takes 3 times as many whippings as Pyre BNB does right now. Does that make sense? Meaning Pyre Phantom takes 3 times as many red candles from metatrage. Does that make sense? Okay, so even if Pyre Phantom is decaying at the exact same rate, it's still going to just need to work that much harder to effectively bring 2-ohm, 3-ohm, and Z-ohm up. Does that make sense? 2-ohm by itself is like 40% of the GPSC in market cap. Does that make sense? So 2-ohm is literally 10 times bigger than Z-ohm. Does that make sense? So like right now, if we were just looking at meeting and metatrage by itself, it would take 10 times as long. Well, kind of. I mean, the math is a little bit more complicated there. But 2 ohm is so big. Does that make sense? It's fucking gigantic. If we hadn't changed 3 ohms peg, 3 ohm would be even bigger. Does that make sense? Right. So Z ohm couldn't right now. It might make sense, by the way, with something called NURV, NURV. It might make sense to sell Z ohm for 2 ohm or 3 ohm and then mead. Right. So what will happen there depends on how diamond handed Z ohm holders want to be. But the point being there is, yes, because Z ohm is still above, Pyre Phantom still needs to work at carrying all that weight. Does that make sense? So Pyre Phantom needs to go work harder on 2 ohm because 2 ohm is so gigantic. This is like 2 ohm is just so fucking big, and that's why it's taking this long. And again, by the way, this is not the system in its completion. Like the IWV is definitely part of phase 1 because otherwise Pyre Phantom is a shit coin, right? Without the IWV, all Pyre Phantom does is just wait to decay. Okay, would you guys agree? Would everybody agree that all Pyre Phantom does is wait to decay without the IWV? Right. Yeah, exactly. So literally, first of all, Alessio, I want you guys to see this because later on, when the IWV is also part of it, this is going to get lost in the noise. Does that make sense? Like you're going to get you're going to kind of forget about this because the way Pyre Phantom's behavior is going to be completely fucking different. Okay. Once the Incantation Witch Vault, indeed the Cauldron, once the Incantation Witch Vault is active, Pyre Phantom's focus is now going to be that and not the decay. Does that make sense? So you are, I guess you could say, privileged to see it in this kind of neutralized state because Pyre Phantom right now is a shitcoin, right? By the indefinition of a shitcoin, there's no real reason to buy Pyre Phantom. Does that make sense? Alessio, did you read Convince Me Harder, Daddy? If you guys didn't read this document here, I'll link it again. Okay, so what I mean by that is like, yeah, there's no real reason to buy it right now, right? I wouldn't buy it. I'm me to trudge through it, but I don't buy it, you know? Yeah, exactly. There's no point. And the thing is, Alessio, once it has a use, the paradigm for that coin shifts. And that is also why the discussions around the IWV will take place in the PyreSwap server. Does that make sense? Because we're all having the Metatraj conversations in the Knighthood servers. But once we get into the smoldering and incantations and stuff like that, that is a PyreSwap conversation. Because now we're playing the PyreSwap game. And this also helps create the concept of red candles being good for more coins. More on that later. But it's from that. It'll be from the Incantation of Witch Vault that you might start seeing the whole pace start speeding up, if that makes sense. The Incantation of Witch Vault can also literally make it like the decay is redundant. Like you won't even think of the decay anymore. But who knows what will happen, right? It also requires Kia Dezo to get the Incantation